Before I begin, I'd just like to say this particular topic on climate change and the section we did, we tied it into COVID. It was difficult for me to teach it. I mean, at two levels, because I was in a bit of a dilemma. Inundated with their own personal problems with COVID. The media is just saturated with COVID day in, day out, and people are going through some really difficult times. But at the same time, I thought it was a really good space to introduce the topic and have students think about a major public policy issue, public health policy issue that's within the public domain, within the news cycle, and that's going to be around for quite a while. So I kind of I put this on a discussion tab on Blackboard, and I kind of just went with the flow and engaged the students, and we engaged each other on on Blackboard during that week and that cycle. Now going forward, I'm thinking to incorporate the aspect of climate change, possibly in the fall, around a narrative of how I feel the class is going. So I think I'd use the first few weeks and gauge on how deeply my students would like to engage with this topic, because I have to be sensitive about just the general good, right, or the general will of the class. But sort of some of the broad themes I was thinking about in terms of a teaching pedagogical framework were about students organizing a public forum on an issue around climate change. So they would decide what kind of speakers they want to bring in from local higher ed institutions with diverse views on reasons and actions that should be taken surrounding climate change. And strategies we could use around this is students could come up with their own speakers. I could use my own networks, and also faculty on campus could come on board and could also, expand our network in terms of potential speakers on climate change. And they will also show films and share other materials on the causes and consequences of climate change within this broad framework of the public forum that they'll be organizing. I'm thinking to structure it as a scaffolded project that we could do over the semester that could eventually, at the end of a semester, become this big day or week when we'd be discussing climate change issues. At this point, I'm thinking maybe a day, but scaffolded and maybe have a final public forum when we have all the speakers on one particular day. And then students will also invite state legislators, local and county officials who can speak to the actions politicians are taking within New York State and why they're doing that. And students will start out with a small group forum which presents to combined classes or to the school community at lunch, and they will then plan a public forum to be held during or after school in the gymnasium or the library or other large facility which will be open to the public. And the way I'm thinking to sequence it is to scaffold a lot of the assignments, small assignments, which would eventually lead into the broad public forum when all these speakers would be invited and be engaged in terms of issues of climate change. I'm hoping within the narrative and the framework of this discussion that obviously elements of COVID would come in, issues of public health, issues of the connections between climate change, race, ethnicity, urban deserts, globalization will also be tied into the framework. But ideally, the way I'm thinking to do it is to have it as a student-centric project. So early in the semester, have them up, have them in different groups, and have specific times during the class preferably towards the end when they could actually get into their groups and keep working on sections of this assignment towards the broad project, the final project of the public forum. So that's sort of more the teaching side. For me personally, in terms of more of the research, I'm really intrigued about this connection between climate change and public health, and how that interaction is playing out, not only within the United States, but within sort of a broad international framework. And I've been in touch with Professor Chasek, who's up in Manhattan College. And she does specific policy work with the United Nations on climate change issues. She's one of the experts in the field. And her training, she went to Johns Hopkins, so her training is very public policy specific. The political science departments there, and the school generally is very known for public policy framing of some of these issues. And she's an expert on climate change. But more importantly, thinking about how to use some of her work not only in the classroom, but within this broader project that the students will be working on to create public-facing narratives and create knowledge that can be publicly shared on issues of climate change within a project, for example, that some of the students will be engaging in. So very broadly, that's generally where I'm going with this. Yes, if anyone has any questions or you'd like me to clarify something, I'd be glad to.
Wow, that sounds really exciting and like ambitious. Are you thinking about partnering with other instructors and other disciplines on your campus or were you thinking your one class would be kind of the center of running the public forum?
So there's my ideal vision and there's a reality. My ideal vision is to have the combined classes and engage with multiple faculty and probably, hopefully, with other institutions. The reality is I might have to just get realistic, and it might have to be more scaled down. Either probably I'll try and do it, maybe a partnership between classes, maybe 2 or 3 classes get together and maybe have a 40-student class combined with 2 other classes and maybe have a public forum of 100 students is what I'm thinking. And I hate to sound like I'm looking at the project as the glass half empty, but I have to be realistic with COVID and the confusion and a lot of the bureaucratic issues around organizing at this point.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, I love the public focus of your project. And obviously that's so different now. Like, you can't gather people of like that size in one place currently. So it's hard to think about how to do that well if it's online. Anyone else? Questions, comments, anything you want to add?
So I think this sounds really cool. But one of the things I was thinking about is that you were talking about scaffolding the assignments, and like maybe one of the ways you can get around not maybe being able to have these forums is to have the students think about how they would actually, what is it called when you moderate, how they would moderate these forums. So what kind of questions, so like scaffolding in, if we were able to do this, or when we do this, whatever, like what are important issues that you would want to have these people talk about in the forum? Yeah. Which might be a way to get around that, because then maybe they can turn that on themselves, in a classroom situation or in a virtual classroom situation where they're discussing these things with each other instead of having the forum. So you're not losing that work if this is something that can't be done in the fall.
Yeah, thanks.
now. We're like, here's what I would like to do.
I know.
Here's what might be possible.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea to have your class also just practice being like a public forum. I really like that idea, John. Like, what if they're the forum? Like, they get to play the expert, kind of like Model UN, but maybe a little bit different. And then they moderate their own panel, so they get used to it in the class. That seems like a really good scaffolded step.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and hopefully you cannot also hear my neighbor across the courtyard who is singing music theater right now. That's been fun. Joys of working from home. So I did this, David, that was so great to hear and interesting. I feel like what I had prepared is super micro in comparison. And partially that is because of the class that I'm teaching is very more sort of foundational, first year writing class. And it's basically how to read and write for college students. And I'm finding that one of the challenges of teaching climate change is that there's so many assumptions with students and lots of kind of buzzwords. Pollution is one that keeps coming up again and again. And the struggle is getting them to specify, when you say pollution, what do you mean? And it's really hard. And they say air pollution. Okay, what kind of air pollution? What chemicals are we talking about? Where? And so these kinds of specificities are a struggle, ongoing struggle that we're having. And I think attention to that struggle has been really fruitful. And I think that's part of teaching sort of environmental and climate change stuff too, is that a lot of our students come up with these kinds of set assumptions that are really hard to unpack, and it's very romantic notions of nature and these sorts of things. So what I put together was just a really sort of something that would take maybe half a class period, a close reading of one paragraph. And I'm going to share it with you. I'm going to include the goals in the chat as well, and then share my screen with you. This will be very familiar to Caitlin and maybe some of the rest of you too. Okay, so I just posted these in the group chat. So this like lesson plan would be have 4 goals: to recall the steps to uncover assumptions in a text. And I'm going to do this with a text, but ideally I would also do it with an image first. So a photograph, using a sort of art photograph where we might just begin by describing things, and then try not to interpret yet, and then push those observations to interpretations or implications or assumptions about the image. So ideally we would do that in the class before, and in the class following I'd say, okay, remember that thing that we did with the image? Well, it's the same process that you can do with a text. Apply these steps to analyze a short academic text. Understand the difference or relationship between form and content. Really hard for my students. Hard in images, but also hard in text. I love it, giving them this Verlaine Klinkenborg sentence from A Few Short Sentences About Writing, where he says, no 2 sentences are exactly the same unless they are word for word exactly the same. And so we spend a lot of time doing that, saying like, even if you just change one word, the implication, the flavor, the texture of it is just slightly different. And so understanding that relationship between form and content. And then finally consider what grants a text authority. And the point is not to maybe say that, to try to question, or sorry, to criticize the authority of everything, but rather not to take it for granted, even something that's peer reviewed. Because everything is made up of, every text is made up of language, and therefore is suspect to scrutiny. One is how I will put it. Okay, so let me share my screen with you, and hopefully this will work. Let me share my whole desktop. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you see that, Kayla? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I gave this text to students early on, so I'm gonna just look at it with you and just quickly walk through what I would do with the students. So this is Actually, not quite the first time the term Anthropocene comes up, but is the second time shortly afterwards in 2002, I believe, by Paul Crutzen, an atmospheric chemist, shared the Nobel Prize. What I would do is they would read this in class. We talk about just general impressions about what did you learn from this? What argument is Paul Crutzen making here? What questions do you have? And then I would locate them to this last paragraph in particular and get them to go through and read it. So I'm just going to read it out loud for you, and you can follow along. Unless there is a global catastrophe, a meteorite impact, a world war, or a pandemic, interesting, yep, mankind will remain a major environmental force for many millennia. A daunting task lies ahead for scientists and engineers to guide society toward environmentally sustained management during the era of the Anthropocene. This will require appropriate human behavior at all scales and may well involve internationally accepted large-scale geoengineering projects, for instance, to optimize climate. At this stage, however, we are still largely treading on terra incognita. I'm still baffled by this pandemic line. It's just uncanny. So at this point, I would point them toward a text about writing that we will have read called A Section from Writing Analytically. Which is a book that I love. A section on uncovering assumptions. And so we'd have like a little focused lesson on, a lot of students refer to assumptions as kind of the hidden meaning of the text. So encouraging them to see it not as something that's hidden because it's right there, but instead to think of it as an assumption that all language and text, or rather all claims, are based on some kind of assumptions. And those assumptions can be that certain evidence is valid, or certain perspectives are valid, or something like that. So this little part talks about how to uncover assumptions in a text. So these are the things that a writer believes, or a method that a writer is using, or the thing that has to be true in order for the writer to arrive at a certain point. The way they put it, which I think is really great, is given its overt claim, what must this reading also already believe? So I'd have them, and they have this really handy how to uncover assumptions. Determine the key terms in a statement and paraphrase them. So I'd have them go through and say, what are some key terms in this text? And how might you state it differently? So going back here, just in this, what would be some key terms? So I would say certainly Anthropocene, global catastrophe, about which I will say more in just a second. Optimize, optimization. Force, environmental force. And I would encourage them to locate these abstract terms so that we can kind of unpack them, because that's where a lot of unpacking can happen. Going back to the steps for this, ask what assumptions the statement rests on, and then consider how these underlying assumptions contribute to your understanding of the reading as a whole. So at this point, I would ask them to ask a lot of questions about these terms that are that Crutzen is using. So one thing that I think is interesting, for instance, by global catastrophe, is that there's a linking as similar, synonymous, between three things: meteorite impact, a world war, and a pandemic. Meteorite impact and pandemic are maybe a little more closely aligned, but a world war is an entirely political event. So it's interesting to me that that is, that Crutzen is grouping those things together. So I'd ask them, what is Paul Crutzen assuming about these three events? You could say that it seems as if he's saying that like they're, we can't control them in some sense. that they kind of happen outside the purview of maybe individual agency, but there seems to be something having to do with sort of public agency or individual agency. Similar with environmental force. Force is something that kind of disindividuates something. The force of humankind too. It's also something that abstracts individual agency. Mankind. We're talking about every human being here. Also the difference between mankind and humankind, splitting hairs and semantics, but it's 2020, that does matter. So things like that, going through, I think you get the idea. So we're talking about assumptions here. What would Crutzen have to believe in order to say something like that? And then the flip side of that would be implications. So if we take this as true, what does that imply? So this would probably take a whole class period asking these things, challenging a bunch of assumptions that students have, also challenging Paul Crutzen's assumptions. It might spark a huge debate, hopefully. And ultimately, I would try to link this and say, this is the kind of work, the kind of close reading that I would encourage you to do in this class, and also would lead to a really good paper topic. If you're not sure what to write about, go deep and narrow and specific, and really just kind of do what's sometimes called hair splitting, but that's exactly what we're interested in this class, of thinking about why use these words, what do these words imply, and yeah, I think that's all I got.
Oh my God, there's so much to say about that article, Eric. I'm glad you put it up for us. I just, every time I read it, I'm like, oh.
So
many.
It's interesting, because the word that I stuck on was catastrophe, because we refer, like, so because he's tangential to like what I teach. All three of those things, I would have just said, oh, he's just listing things that are going to kill a bunch of people.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Like,
and I think and I would also not expect students to bring this up, but I might at the very end talk about how the word optimize is a key word for 20th century eugenics, all about optimization of the human race, specifically the white race. And that word is like for a student of Euro-American history, that's like alarm bells, which would probably get us into a conversation about intentions versus what actually, obviously, I mean, I don't think Paul Crutzen was aware of that or thinking about that at all. I'm sure he wasn't. And yet it's still kind of lurking in the lexicon of some hard science. So that's an interesting debate and conversation that I have with my students a lot too.
That's really fascinating, because like we use that word statistically. Like I don't even have, so that, I mean, he's an atmospheric scientist, his whole thing is statistics. And not geology, which is why he calls it the Anthropocene.
Totally, exactly.
What a great lesson.
I liked how you approach like doing the close reading. Like I like that exercise. Like it's really good for like, in your case, like you're teaching a writing course, but I like how you can just take a text and just stick to a paragraph and just like line by line, like do a content analysis. And I really like it because that opens the door for really good discussion with students. So I like that approach, Eric.
Yeah, Eric, I also like the unpacking and sort of the questioning assumptions in the inference of words and some of the implicit and explicit ideas and meanings we attach to certain words. And there was that section where you had about the nature caused defects, like the meteorites, and of course, World War. And from my end, thinking politics and government and states, and to what extent are some of these acts of God, so to speak, and to what extent are these issues around climate change also narratives of that are humanly caused, right? Caused by human actions. What would be really interesting within your field, I think, I really struggle with this in terms of some of my discussions. If you zero in, for example, around that word of mankind, as you mentioned, it's 2020, why are we still using this word, right? But narratives around that, I think sometimes in some of my class discussions, you zero in on these words and they're very important. And it's hard to really balance that tension between students' passion in terms of wanting to discuss the word and the agency and power that word had over time, but also keeping it on topic. Because a lot of these discussions can really get tangential and really excite a lot of emotion. And I sometimes struggle with that in terms of keeping things focused on, okay, this is the word, this is the context in terms of how I'd like you can critique the word and come up with the word in this framework. But then to what extent do you have to keep students on task in terms of, okay, we know this is a powerful word, we know there's a lot of genderized constructions around it, politicized constructions, etc. But how do we stay on track? So I really like the project. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like just in that one paragraph, you're getting at so many issues that are central about climate change, which is amazing. Because I think a lot of what we've been talking about in this group is how it's so broad and so overwhelming. Like, how can you cover so much? And like, even just in that short paragraph, there's so many assumptions that are going to be uncovered that, like you said, also students may hold as well. So like, it really, to have something that narrow be able to like generate so much is, I think, really great. Because otherwise you'd have to assign 20 academic articles and like try to cover so much, and instead you can critique Paul Crutzen and that incredibly short piece on the Anthropocene. I remember researching it and being like, this is the definitional text, and then looking at the other one that's the co-authored version, and it's also really short. Like, the laying out of this major term is really not like, it was not well developed at the beginning. That's interesting in and of itself, that that's where the term originates, since there's so much more writing on it now. Should we keep going?
Thanks so much for this feedback. It's helpful, and it's interesting to hear your thoughts too from the different disciplines. Thanks.
Joseph, are you next?
Hi, everybody. So thank you for sharing your lesson plans. They're amazing. For my lesson, which is going to be taught this Friday, I'm going to be talking about environmental anthropology and climate change, but also, since my course is meeting every 2 weeks, it was previous arrangement with the students, we're going to be doing synchronous and asynchronous depending on like every 2 weeks. So what I'm going to be talking to you is what I'm prepared for this week. Those are the guiding questions that I submitted to my students for this week's lesson. So I'm going to be talking about environmental anthropology and also food. But since we're talking about just climate change, that's a whole lesson by itself. So I've just included like the questions that I presented to my students to dive into the topic. So the first question that I included was, what are some examples in which anthropology could be useful to the public, environmental activists and government officials when considering policies related to the environment? because I want my students to, and that's something that I've been thinking about since this semester started. I want my students to, since this is an introductory course, for them to grasp on the topics and the themes and see how they can apply to multiple settings. So I want them to see how the concepts that we're talking about in the case of environment and climate change apply to their lives. So I want them to think of examples in which this knowledge can be applied to create policy, to create um, social discussions or different or challenging already established ideas of the environment. So I wanted them to think of that, especially in these times when we're facing an anti-scientific rhetoric, especially from the federal government. So I think it's very useful for them to see how this is helpful. The second piece that I assigned this week was a short journalistic article that's talking about a coal plant in Puerto Rico and how the anthropologist that was interviewed is talking about environmental racism. So I included that piece for them to understand how certain communities are affected more by these specific situations, like in the case of Puerto Rico, like a coal plant, but there are multiple cases that can be replicated across the United States. Like in Staten Island, we have specific factories that are close to communities of color and minority migrant communities. If we go across the United States, there are different cases across the board. So I just wanted them to see how can this look at like in the ground, like how learning about the environment and learning about social justice can be applied for us to analyze how these situations happen in specific social settings. And then I also provided them a short video that was done by the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean from the United Nations. And basically that short video is around 3 minutes. I can share with you the link, it's on YouTube. Basically like the UN, in the case of the ECLAC, is they focus on that specific video, how Latin America and the Caribbean is going to be affected by climate change. So they're mentioning like how agriculture is going to be affected, how certain oh my God, I forgot the word. Agriculture and certain ecosystems are going to be affected by the temperature change. So I wanted them to see in that visualization, like how does this look like in the future? How is it foreseen and how is it being forecasted? And I wanted them to talk about why Latin America and the Caribbean, when compared to other regions of the world, are some of the least pollutant areas of the world. So they generate the least pollution when compared to other regions, but they are going to be the ones that are going to be more affected by climate change. So those are like the 3 general points that I wanted to highlight. And also connecting it to food, I remember this short article that I'm going to send you right now, which basically talks about how climate change is driving immigration from Central America to the United States. And basically it's connected using the example of coffee farmers, like how coffee farmers that worked in El Salvador or Guatemala depend on that specific crop for their well-being and for their family support, to support their family financially, but how climate change is affecting how that crop is grown and how that crop is harvested, which at the same time is acting as a push factor for them to leave their countries to other parts of the world. So I just wanted to connect it with food and with the general environment. So like those are like my general 4 points that I want to do for my class. So thoughts, ideas. Thank you. I'm going to share the video right now, the link, so you can check it out later.
I think this is so great, and it's bringing together a lot of huge ideas that are sometimes hard for students to grasp, especially in an intro class, and making it really concrete, which is great. And that is, I think, so many of our challenge is like how to make this tangible and how to show the stakes of it, and the uneven stakes, as you pointed out, that people of color and also people in less developed places are going to be hit hardest. I just came across something that is more theoretical, but it might just be for your own brain. But I don't know. Do you know Lauren Berlant's book,
Slow death.
Cruel Optimism? Yes, Slow Death, exactly. I just came across that, and it made me think of that exactly. And
You know that I originally was gonna sign that chapter, but that chapter is like 40 pages long.
It's really long. It's kind of dense too, but for if you don't know it, I think it's so brilliant and it's really interesting. But she talks about a lot of things in that, but some of it is about industrial agriculture and the way that a kind of surplus of certain crops like corn or whatever makes it finds its way into cheaper foods, but are less nutritious. And so you have these higher calorie, lower calorie things. But it's really eerie and to think about these industrial companies kind of planning for their surplus problem to be solved with the bodies of poorer people of color often. It's like a surplus spatial fix, which is pretty evil and haunting. I'm so glad that you know that. That's really great. If you ever use that in a class, I'd love to know how it goes.
Of course, because believe me, I was like, oh, I would like to integrate this. This is so relevant. This is so useful. But when I was like, oh my God, like it's very long. It's very dense. How am I gonna, for an introductory course, how am I gonna do this? So maybe if I was teaching like an upper level class, I would definitely assign that. But thank you for suggesting it. By the way, Caitlin, I have the video as 2 minutes. I'm gonna share my screen. So give me 1 second. Let me share for you. There we go.
Yeah,
Share.
anytime you can find something short to
Can
show.
you all see it?
Okay. Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna, okay, there we go. Can you listen to it? Can you hear it? No?
No.
Let me give it 1 second because, okay, Caitlin, I have a better idea. I'm gonna send you the link and you can share it yourself because I think with you can share the audio. Okay, let me send it to you really quick. There we go. There you go.
Good idea.
Here you go. Yep. It's such a short clip. It's like 2 minutes, but it's so good and how it breaks it down. So.
Okay. Pulling it up. Oops, whatever I put in was not the right way. Okay, let me share my screen. Working?
Yep.
Climate change demands that we act now. The emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is already causing temperature increases, droughts and floods, rises in sea levels, and glacier melt. According to figures from 2011, Latin America and the Caribbean produce only 9% of the planet's contaminating emissions, but the region is particularly vulnerable to the effects, especially in Central America and the Caribbean. The greatest risks are posed to agricultural production, water availability, forest and biodiversity preservation, tourism in coastal areas, and population health and poverty. Preliminary estimates indicate that if the temperature rises by 2.5 degrees Celsius compared to the historical average, the economic costs of climate change could amount to between 1.5% and 5% of the region's current gross domestic product, GDP. On the other hand, the costs of taking the steps needed to avoid the effects of climate change are estimated to be below 0.5% of the regional GDP. These studies offer enough evidence for decision making. It is urgent that we invest in sustainable infrastructure, in more and better public services and renewable energies, considering that such an investment is the bridge that connects our present with the future we want. Beyond these steps, Only a global agreement based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, along with a change in production and consumption patterns, will allow the region to confront climate change and move towards a new model of sustainable development with equality. Latin America and the Caribbean is still in time.
Well, what do you think?
Yeah, Joseph, I think this is a very exciting project. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, but I think I see some exciting angles you could speak to this topic that students at an intro level could really understand. So, for example, you're talking Latin America. So thinking about pre-Columbian cultural attitudes, institutions towards the environment, and how to take care of the environment, and the use of common pooled resources within the frameworks of pre-Columbian communities, right? Because there's this narrative, particularly within colonized peoples, that history started after the conquistadors came or after the Europeans came to these regions, whereas people in those regions were taking care of the environment and had an attitude towards the use of common pooled resources, which is very different to how we see that now. In terms of ownership, for example, you could do a whole class on that, right? How is land owned? Communal tenure systems, say within Amazon Indian communities. How much do you take out? How do you give back? How do you responsibly use resources? And then maybe juxtapose that with how we see common pool resources now, whether it comes to oceans, the Amazon, and then maybe you could tie in some of these globalization issues around our consumptions in North America and some of the damage that that's doing in South America and
extractivism.
Extractivism, yeah. Now, the other angle you could think about is also, because sort of thinking about, now we know all these problems, right? You always come up with this issue, Joseph, in classes, right? Okay, what do we do now? It's an overwhelming problem. Okay, now the world's going down to hell in a bathtub, and we don't know what to do. Like, oh my God, right? Am I gonna have to give up my comfortable American lifestyle? I like my latte. I like driving my SUV. We have these social norms and social consumption patterns, and this broad idea of the American dream. We're Americans. We have to consume. It's our freedom. It's our right. So constructions of rights around that. But I think there's a section you talked about international organizations and the coordinations of issues around the anthropological issues that you were raising. I think that would be a really interesting narrative in terms of appreciating the challenges of the climate change issues. One, around how countries talk about the issue in terms of who's going to pay for the damage. A lot of the countries that are responsible for the damage don't want to pay for it, and they want the
There's
poorer
no insurance there.
Yeah. And then challenges around creation of these global norms. Who's really creating the norms within an organization, like the clip you just showed, right? The UN, like, how do we create these norms that are not always
one size fits all.
One size fits all, and also Western specific, right? How about creating global norms around taking care of the environment that also provide spaces for communal constructions of ownership around community, rather than individualized constructions around ownership and title, right? So because so like global norms are usually constructed around these rational, legal, institutionalist frameworks we have in the global north, which don't always sit well in communities and in systems where stuff is not owned by one, it's owned by everybody. And this construction of mine, and my is not quite there. So I think you can take this so many ways. It's really exciting.
That's why I also found something interesting when I saw the video, because I was a little hesitant. I was like, oh, it looks like those cheerful videos, like, oh, we still have time, we can fix the world, blah, blah, blah. But with the thing that I found, the key thing that like drew me in was when they're almost at the end, when they're talking about thinking of production and consumption patterns. How are those so vital for the situation that we're going through right now? How by rethinking those economies, by rethinking how we consume, by rethinking how we produce, those are some of the ways that we can, again, this is not going to happen soon, but at least putting that in the conversation is the start to rethinking how we do things. So that's the major takeaway for me for that video.
Yeah.
Just so, of course, like I'm speaking as a economic anthropologist, but like that was the thing that I found most useful, and that I hope that students can, you know, take away from it. Like I always use the example, like when I show them a documentary on like coffee, like most of them were like, I drink coffee every day. I never imagined like there was so much inequality, that there was so much like the situation that the farmers don't get paid enough, like all of that stuff. I'm like, yes. So that's what I want them to think about. Not to say like, oh, I'm not going to drink coffee anymore, but just be responsible in the sense of like, know where it's coming from, where are the conditions, what can we do to advocate for them? Like those are the things that I want them to take from the class. So thank you, David.
So, you know, to also link this with the climate change in the region, like Costa Rica makes, like, what was it, like 2 years ago, they hit 99% all renewable energy. But that did come with problems because a lot of it was hydroelectric, which now we're starting to learn is also driver of climate change, to have big reservoirs. So, I mean, it's I have a soft spot because I work in Nicaragua, and I think it's one of the best, like it's the best. But it'd be interesting to connect the resources that you were talking about earlier with actually just their energy networks, because in Nicaragua, they conserve energy because they just don't have electricity all the time. They don't have oil, like they use geothermal for a lot of their energy actually. So that might be something interesting to also add into it, is like, you know, not only are these the countries that are going to be affected by it, but you know, they already are proving that this infrastructure is something that can support some modern life. Like Costa Rica is a modern country and a successful democracy. So that might be an interesting spin on there. And I think I might have some references somewhere. I made a note of it to try, and if I have anything, I'll send it over to you.
You can paste it on the copy.
I'm not going to do it right now because it would be deep. Yeah. It'll be deep in there. And then in your environmental injustice section, one of the things that struck me is Los Angeles, they claim to be all coal-free, except for one power plant that was actually on the Navajo Nation. So the last coal plant Los Angeles was using was actually not in California. It was on the Navajo Nation. So I don't have any references on that. But I mean, if you just Google it, it'll be there. If you want to bring something closer to home, like, look, here's even injustice right here in the United States that we've offshoot to other nations within North America.
There's another article I'm going to share with you. It was published on the Times, and this was in 20, like a month ago. And when I saw it, I read it, and it was like, caught my attention. New York's last coal-fired power plant is closing. And I found it, it's in upstate New York. And it's an interesting article because obviously it is, and that's like for more critical, like going in deep for a conversation, like, yes, climate change, acknowledging like safer and more environmental friendly ways of producing energy, but at what cost? Like how are these social structures and economies that are built around these old school, if we want to put it that way, ways of doing things? change when technologies change. And like, I found it interesting. So I'm going to share with you, if you have a time. It's called, where's the power plant is in Barker, New York. So it's like very north. So yeah.
Yeah, it's sitting on the Marcellus Shale, right? So that's natural gas territory as well, which is really interesting. I saw that article. The New York Times, I think, did a pretty good job of like.
And the pictures were fascinating. Like the pictures of the article, like give you an idea of like how that community was, you know, their livelihood revolved around the plant. So it reminds me of like these company towns, like Detroit, for example. Like the lives of the people are organized around the car manufacturers. So that's an example of what happens when we transition from one source to another, and how that affects a community, like you were pointing out, like with the hydroelectricity. So like that's another issue, but there you go if you want to like check it out.
I think it's so important to ask that question that you were just asking for students, like that at what cost, because there's sometimes an assumption that there's like a magic bullet. And also sometimes I love Naomi Klein's term, the techno fix, just like which technology is going to fix the problem, without questioning other things like levels of energy consumption, laws, all kinds of other things that don't have it, or that could actually shift the infrastructure of the technology. So I think that's really productive in the classroom to really get to ask the questions from different perspectives. I love that.
And by the way, I didn't tell you, like this picture is from Puerto Rico. It's a farmer's market in San Juan. So just, you can see like plantains, cassava, potatoes, pumpkins, like all the good stuff. So
it took me
Your
way too
backgrounds are
long to
making me
realize.
hungry.
Yeah. It took me way too long to realize that that was a photo and that you weren't actually in a food market.
Yeah, like you joined us from Essex Market.
I wish I was there, but I was stuck in Harlem in my shoebox apartment. So with no backyard, no nothing. So
Okay, so like can you guys see that?
Yeah.
So like, I guess one of the problems that I have with teaching climate change is that it's part of a course, and it's part of a natural disasters course. And, you know, as someone who's teaching science, it's really hard to not, or to go into these debates that like you go into in those lesson plans. I was like, wow, like how would that come across? Because like we're so ingrained as science instructors at being, here's the hypothesis, here's the data that supports it, and like not going into a lot of the extra, you know, solutions and so on and so forth. And I think that happens more in the upper division, which would be taught by the climate scientists. But basically, I just kind of put it together. I took some slides to kind of show how I talk about climate change, because I think what's important, one of the objectives I have for my students to take away from the class is how do we know climate's changing? How do we know, you know, that there's an anthropogenic part of it? And so I really go hard on the, you know, how do we know what we know, and how do we, you know, and what data are people using to see through this? So, you know, I have a whole section where we talk about, you know, where do these past temperatures come from? And I guess the main thing I'm trying to get to when I talk through this is why we use models, and how we know which models work and which models don't work based on having past data. So if the models can recreate what we have measurements of, then we have more reliable, then their predictions are more reliable. So I go through and talk about all of the paleothermometers that we use. The students have already been exposed to isotopes, because we talk about isotopes very early in the semester. So then I give them a little lecture on how oxygen isotopes that we find in all of our shells and in trees and so on and so forth, or how we can actually look at past temperatures. And I don't know, I like, like, how good are you, all of you, at your isotopes? So, like for this section, we talk about how just like if you went to help a friend move and you're lazy, you're always going to go and pick up the lightest things you can find. So our climate system does the same thing with isotopes. So if you're evaporating water, it's going to be the lightest isotopes that are going to be evaporated first, because it takes more energy to evaporate something heavier. And it matters even at an atomic scale. So we actually get fractionation of these isotopes that prove that we can go back in later and look at sediments and at fossils and recreate what the temperature would have had to been like to change the fractionation of isotopes of oxygen. And actually, this curve goes all the way back to before there was an Antarctic ice sheet, with isotopes and looking at temperatures. So if you look at the left side graph here, I put a scale on the bottom, which kind of takes, because like climate scientists just talk about oxygen, but here's an idea for how much temperature swing at the bottom of the graph there. So you can see that there is variation that happens in our temperatures throughout what we call the Quaternary. But modern time is at the top here. And so you can see that there's been a downward trend since glaciation happened in Antarctica and it became permanent. And so then I walk into, okay, so we have direct measurements of temperature. And I talk about, okay, so people like to say, oh, there's plenty of explanations for this. So we've already, by this point in the class, we've already talked about the sun and like solar variety. So like this would be what the temperature variation would be if it was only due to solar cycling. Volcanoes cause cooling. So this is what it would be with large eruptions. And then this is just our variability of, just because climate system, every system has variability in it. And so when you look at the global surface temperature, it seems to have a similar trend to anthropogenic or CO2 emissions. And so then talk about how we measure CO2. And like one of the things when people first started talking about climate change is that people were like, why would you put your CO2 monitoring on a volcano? And Mauna Loa is not actively degassing, so it was put there because the Big Island doesn't have a lot of industrial outputs, and it's in the middle of the ocean. And so here's what our CO2 has been doing, and it's been increasing. We're now always above 440 parts per million in the atmosphere. And so then, I take it from there and talk about, okay, well then what's the greenhouse effect and why is this important? And then from there, that's pretty much the end of that lesson. And then they generally have, I give them an assignment where they are given some data and they have to plot it up, where they start recreating temperature profiles for different areas. And then the next time we come back, we start talking about microclimates and urban heat islands, and then talk about sea level rise. And then it all wraps into, okay, all of these effects of climate change, what natural disasters are, yeah, I guess I use disasters, but because disaster is a anthropogenic or anthrocentric term, right? Because like it's basically economics and loss of life. So when we look at this, what natural events will be amplified by these effects? That's the way that I approach climate change in the classes I teach, because most of my classes are about rocks and explosions. But yeah, so if you ever need to touch base and explain how we know that climate's changing, then I can help you with that.
So great. I want to take your class. I also have no idea what an oxygen isotope is.
Oh, okay. Just real quick. Atoms are made up of three things, right? So an element's defined by protons, which are positive charges that are inside the atom, and you have electrons that orbit around that are negative, and there are neutrons, which are actually protons and electrons that are joined together. And you can stuff extra ones of those inside of your isotope, or inside of your atoms. So you have different varieties of each element that have different masses. So basically, neutrons are a way that atoms can gain or lose weight, but still remain the same element.
Thanks.
So there you have a little bit more insight into how my brain works. It's super, I'm just like.
I also just really quickly, I think it's so helpful to just have some of those charts that you have, because a lot of times, I know sometimes I'm scrambling to find like real quick visualizations or short videos or something that it's just like explains the mechanisms of climate change or even the greenhouse effect or something like that. And that's so valuable to have those and to understand that. I actually need to do a lot of work to understand that way better than I do.
Yeah, it's like I've really enjoyed listening to all semester the way that each of you approach getting people to your discipline, because one of my major like teaching objectives is to get students to just be able to see a graph and realize that graph is data like being presented like it's a paragraph. And like, math teachers are not always so good at teaching that, because they're trying, you're trying to teach the mechanisms of how you do mathematics. And science teachers, a lot of my colleagues and even myself when I first started teaching are really scared of even using math in their classes, even though it's how we discuss things with each other. So like, yeah, I can share any of these graphs with you guys. That's fine. Or, I mean, again, like, as long as I have my grad center email address, you know how to get in touch with me. So if you ever need something, just let me know.
You're definitely my go-to science consultant, which you'll see in my PowerPoint as well. John did already help me with this. So.
That was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited to show you the slides so you can see it. Anything else before I go very quickly through the PowerPoint I'm going to show you? If you have any climate deniers, I think we just send them to John. Like, look at all this math. That'll scare anybody. Okay, let me share my screen with you. And let me start, oh, here we go. Let me start by saying that, so this is about a novel that I teach that's very popular, Frankenstein, which almost everyone has read and knows about. But I got really interested in the historical context of the novel because there's a global climate event caused by a volcano when Mary Shelley is writing the novel. And it's something we talk about a lot in literature and like literary studies and particularly science studies. But it's not really being connected to contemporary climate change. And I feel like this event, I don't know, John, if this comes up in your studies at all, but because it was a global cooling of almost 2 degrees, seems really relevant. It's like, we know what the consequences were. And Joseph, very related to what you're talking about, like agriculture, like the effects from this, we've seen what a sudden, and obviously global warming is not a sudden here, but what this kind of temperature change does. And it was absolutely catastrophic in the way we were using that term in terms of loss of life, loss of like the ways that we live, just radical change. And so all of that kind of is hinted at in the novel. It's not particularly explicit, but it is the historical background of the novel. So I've been wanting to teach the novel from this perspective, but because I really don't ever lecture in my literature classes, I've been trying to figure out like how to provide this much context for a text and then allow students to kind of look for that in the text. So what I'm showing you would be more like what would be a lecture, which I'm not going to do here, and which is more of a research project. So let me just share the screen. And that's my background, is the volcano that I'm going to talk about. John, I'm a little nervous to talk about volcanoes with you.
You're gonna do just fine.
You're a good teacher. Okay, we're going here. And I'm going to hit present. Okay, yeah, so this is a satellite image, so you can see the crater of the volcano still. That's a pretty contemporary image. So this is, from what I understand, the most significant volcanic eruption in recorded history. And the crater is immense. So this is like a satellite footage. Okay. So I wanted to start out like talking about the novel, which I'm not going to do, but if this were the class, we'd sort of talk about the two characters that are at the center of the novel and the conflicts between them, and sort of think about how the context of this global climate event potentially changes our reading of these very iconic characters. So that's kind of the question for the class. This is like an older engraved image of the scientist fleeing. Here, this is the scientist, Victor Frankenstein, fleeing his creation of this creature, sometimes also called the monster, who's created from dead body parts and sort of questionable origins, whether they're human, animal, some sort of mixture. So I'm really interested in reading the creature through an animal studies lens, which is sort of examining and questioning the concept of the human and like who counts as human and why. So I find this character really relevant for those kinds of questions. And then that's very closely connected to some of the questions about the Anthropocene, like what is the anthropos in the Anthropocene, and to what Eric was mentioning about mankind, humankind, like what kind of terms are we using about the human when we're talking about climate change? So there's a lot of like steps of thinking through these two characters. And then the mad scientist character is great because then I want to look at Paul Crutzen's work that Eric was showing us earlier and talk about some of these geoengineering solutions, in quotes, to climate change. So this is one of the original maps of the Tambora explosion, which I think is amazing. Like if you could see it maybe in a little bit more detail, is, you know, these are hand drawn because this is the 19th century and trying to sort of sketch out what happened. And this is later, several years after the actual explosion itself. That's an even more intense indicator of the explosion. This is a map of the ash cloud. So because the volcanic explosion was so intense, it created what's known as the year without a summer. And you can see the ash cloud, the coverage is significant. Like this is almost a whole swath of the Northern Hemisphere here and even further south. And the novel takes place really centrally between England, France, and Germany. So that's, you'll see in some coming graphs where the majority of the cooling effect was, but this really was a global event from this perspective. So the whole summer, all the temperatures were much cooler, but the effects of this lasted for 3 years, so a long time. So you can see some of the change in temperature here in this graph. And like I said, you can see really that it's heavily concentrated in where the novel takes place. And as we were discussing, the effects of this were extreme and things that now look pretty familiar to us as people who are living through climate change, these superstorms, the droughts, the extreme temperatures, the flooding, and all the effects that this had, particularly on agriculture, which results in famine, which then results in plague. So as conditions degrade. So we already have a lot of information about this from the past, in addition to this currently happening now from warming. So I found this interesting graph about the geoengineering possibilities that Crutzen talks about a lot, including the aerosols in the stratosphere, which is designed to mimic the volcano's effect. So the idea is that we could harness this power that volcanoes have by doing it ourselves to cool the global temperature, just like what happened in 1816. But then there's also just other fascinating proposals here, all of which seem really related to Frankenstein to me as a novel about concerns about scientific hubris and things we should not do because the consequences might be out of our control. So the novel seems really relevant under these circumstances and really fascinating. So I found another scientific article that was basically trying to weigh the benefits and risks of specifically the stratospheric geoengineering, which would be the plan to put the aerosols into the stratosphere. And I thought it was really interesting because you see, one, that drought is one of their top concerns. So that's exactly the same thing we saw in 1816. Many other issues, but also things that really touch on what the novel is about. So number 9 is human error. Number 10 is unexpected consequences. And number 17 is moral authority, like who has the right to change the climate and can we do that? So I was thinking about using the novel as a way to kind of get at some of these questions that are related to a contemporary debate over geoengineering, since Shelley is really thinking about scientific debates in her time period and trying to kind of bring the 19th century into direct relation to climate change questions now. That's it.
Super cool.
So great, Caitlin. And I think it's so awesome to bring in a really heated contemporary debate and match it with the context of the novel and those human error and also moral agency. I mean, that is so much about what that book is about, and just fascinating.
And it was interesting. It was in the scientific article. Like, I think it was the more I've been reading these scientific articles, the more I've been noticing that there's, especially since the introduction of Crutzen's work, there's been a lot of more like humanistic response because it's necessary. Like, it's missing in some of the other, in some of his work. And so other scientists seem to be, John, I don't know if you found that, but it seems like there's more. Like, I was surprised in reading that article.
Yeah, I think there's a bit more of humanities that are going into things that are more about things that are affecting us directly. But there's still, like, you would still get crushed if you tried to anthropomorphize something, right? Because you'd be like, volcanoes aren't having temper tantrums. But yeah, I mean, you want, especially Robot, who like is a big sulfate guy in the atmosphere, like trying to get their work noticed is an important thing, because there's so much dismissal because things are just so fact-based, right? That there's so much dismissal that there's actually a connection between, oh, here's the science that's being done, and then, oh, here are the problems that we're starting to see. And so I think it's starting to creep in that people are now writing for other audiences besides just each other that are over here in the science realm, which I'm not mad about, because it's nice to have papers that are nice to read.
Yeah, this was readable. That's why I picked it.
Caitlin, I think you can also do just that image of the scientist and the monster. There could be a whole class just around discussions of that very picture in relation to not only the literary context, but also some of the environmental imagery that sort of develops, and what exactly the author was trying to convey, or the artist.
Mm-hmm.
I like how how you're using the novel as the center of of your presentation, but how you're also integrating to it like all the historical work that has been published around that specific moment that the novel took place in. Like I found it fascinating, like how you found all those historical documents, like how you were able to integrate all that information to give us a clear picture of the context in which the novel was written and what was happening at that moment. So I find it fascinating how you're doing the bridge between literature, humanities, science, and like to bring this to a discussion. So it's great. I loved it.
Thanks. Okay, now I'll feel more confident going into the class discussion on it, because this isn't how I usually teach the novel. I just allude to all this, but I don't really go in depth about the contemporary connection between this climate change event and contemporary climate change, but it seems like the time to do so.
It makes me think of something that I just read, a book called Unthinking Mastery by Juliet Singh. Do you know this book?
The title is really familiar to me.
It's maybe worth skimming, but it's maybe not something that I would give a whole chapter to students, but there might be a really interesting nugget or page that you could put in discussion with this. And the reason I'm thinking that is because thinking to what David was saying about the image, and also linking the moral authority of geoengineering, and also the animation of the creature, there's this idea that like the problem is domination and mastery. And the book does a really good job of seeing knowledge, our attempt to try to master, to get a master's in something, and sort of the mastery of knowledge, which is, I feel like, so much of what Victor Frankenstein's arc is, sort of trying to master this sort of dark art, and how that's actually that's linked up with colonization and also destruction of ecological systems. So it might be just an idea to like throw into a discussion or something.
That sounds great. Thank you. I know we're really at our time.
You all make me want to redo my general ed and actually learn it all this time. This is all fascinating stuff.
Same, John. We want to take your science class.
I know. I would have loved to have like a physical science professor like you teaching all that cool stuff.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
totally
John,
just
nice.
a checkbox student.
Yeah,
thank you.
The only C I got in college was highlights of astronomy, and it was not my best moment as a student.
And it wasn't highlighting anything, right? Well,
like part of the activity that I have been doing that I call water journal. Let me see if it's gonna work. Can you see it? So the water journal is like an initial part of the unit that we talk about climate change. So I think I have like 3 or 4 weeks talking about climate change. And since climate change is a huge topic, I decided to focus on water issues and water issues in different perspectives. We talk about the importance of water in our daily life, but also we talk about situations in which water is disruptive. So storms and flood and this kind of situation. So the homework is pretty simple. So during one day, they have to, they pick the day that they want to do it, and they should take pictures of water every time that they realize the presence of water in any state. It can be any place, any situation. And so the only rule is to, every time that you remember, we realize, you take a picture. And after this whole process, they write about this. And I ask them to reflect about the perception of the water itself, but also the perception of the process of remember or thinking about something all the time. So here I put like the learning goals, not just for this assignment, but how this assignment is connected with many discussions that we have later on. So we start from this very personal perspective, like me and the water in my house and blah, blah, blah. And then we move forward to talk about social issues, economic issues, and reflect upon other stuff. So reflect the importance of water by using photography, promote active engagement by tracking the water in different situations, reflect our take for granted relationship to water, etc. So here I bring like 2 examples of, I pick like 3 examples. I was not just like choosing the best ones, just like anyone. They have like different size. Some students really engage and write like 3 pages. Some students write like 1 page. Here you can see like inside situations, but also outside. And so this person like wrote what she was doing. This is a second example. So you can see it's a little bit different. So it has toilet, bathroom. Let me check this side here. Shower, water bottle, memorial, like 9/11 memorial, rain, and it goes on because it's like 3 or 4 pages. And here is one quote from one of the students. She said, "I really appreciate the level of awareness I now have because of this assignment. This is pretty common. It's not just this one. I realized that I don't pay enough attention to how often I encounter water in my everyday life. I often take the ability to access clean water for granted. During the assignment, I was forced to imagine how difficult it must be to live in an area that doesn't have the luxury of accessing water. We all need water to survive. Where there is water, there is life. With that said, I believe that the denial of access to water is the denial of the quality of life itself. Until more individuals realize how much our life revolves around water, we will continue to buy into the idea that access is water is a privilege, not a right. And then she talks about how the image make her think about the value of the water, and etc. This is a second example. I'm gonna ask one of you to read because when I'm reading English, it's like blah blah. So if someone can read this part, Eric, can you do this for me?
Yeah. By doing this assignment, I also come to realize how much water gets wasted in the United States compared to other parts of the world. For example, in my country, the amount of water that we use is calculated and used accordingly because it is expensive and there is not enough. However, people are wasting it here because most people do not have to pay the water bill. The American people should know that if they keep wasting, they will find themselves in the same situation as some other underprivileged countries. Even though I woke up with a plan to keep track of water throughout the day, there were moments that I forgot about the assignment. This is because water exists in so many forms, situations, colors, textures, and also exists as part of products. As a result, we tend not to be aware of the presence of water when we perceive it. This assignment is very important because it makes us realize how blessed we are to have access to fresh water every day. In addition, it also makes us question our behavior toward water and makes better decisions based on this self-assessment.
Thank you. So from this, so I received the assignments from all of them, and then we are in the class together So we start to talk about this activity. So it's pretty amazing. Their experience, they talk about the different situations. At some point they realize that there is watering products. So it's like they start to take a picture of everything. So at some point they realize that it's impossible actually to do the assignments. But they keep doing and they keep trying to show diversity of situations. So in the class, we sit together in a circle and I ask them to talk about the whole process. And I ask them to focus on two aspects, the importance of water and the psychological dimension. So if it was easy to do this exercise, if it was easy to remember about something and be like paying attention to something. And because in psychology, we have a lot of articles and ideas of, okay, we can do this by asking people to do this, to be aware of something. But in this very simple example, which is an assignment, they get points for this. It's hard to be thinking about something all the time. So we talk about this psychological part. And then we start to do a list of situations, use states in which water is related to. I have normally two students that put it down on the board. And we reflect the social issues around the water, how water is it's embedded and it's part of everything, where the cities are located, what kind of economic activity we can do or not. So everything. I'm not gonna show the whole thing, but just to show you that from this, I talk about this individualistic in approach in psychology that focus on residential consumption. So talks about how we have to reduce the water consumption in our home. And we move forward to talk about other issues such as accessibility, urbanization, conflicts around water, because actually in the best scenario, residential consumption, it's like 10% of water consumption. And from that, the class that we start to talk about climate change, we talk about disaster and water and land and water, storms and droughts and psychology of disaster. And here we have a whole literature on not just what we can do in situations of disasters in terms of recover, but also how can you prepare communities to be more less vulnerable to situations of disaster. So you have to talk about social issues, racism, inequalities, and I try to connect them with this personal perspective. They start like with this picture process in their homes, and I try to move forward for a critical perspective, because I don't like the idea also having them just feel guilty, you know, like, oh my God, I'm using a lot of water. So this is not the point. The point is to pay attention to it, to reflect to this take for granted experience, but also perceive that there are social issues that we have to account in this conversation. That's it. I stop sharing. Yeah.
That was so great. Let's take questions.
That was so great and very inspiring. And I'm really inspired by the sort of visual aspect of the students' responses, the photographs with the writing. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether, have you thought about incorporate or offering like video reflection or sort of like a video diary as an option? I mean, I wonder whether you've tried that or how that might work.
It's a really nice idea. Yeah. Especially for a generation that has a much more natural experience with social media. Yeah, it could be nice to have them. But basically they use their cell phones, which is also another part of this process. I try to incorporate something that is on their hands all the time and take pictures, but yeah. I think like the idea, I have been doing this in a different way in Brazil, but basically ask students to do something for one day, to pay attention to something for one day. And you can track, and you can use the idea of track something, and it's really powerful. So you can use like different situations. Example, it's a pretty simple exercise. So you can use photos, but you can use other like videos or draw and just like list of stuff. I remember one of my students, she wrote like, she was like 2 cups, 3 cups of water, 1 cup of tea. So she was more into this descriptive perspective instead of the pictures itself. And she was trying to calculate how much water she was using. So you have like different ways to approach this.
Yeah, I love it, and I think like it's a great pedagogical tool that you could use for all kinds of things. Like I can like actually envision using this same idea this fall when I talk about, you know, why we know so much about deep earth history, because I could have students think about every time they come across something that was mined out of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like what an amazing assignment. Exactly. Right. And like, why are we so interested in Bolivia? So thanks for sharing. What a great assignment.
Thank you. I'm glad you like it. Yeah. And it was interesting to see the difference in this context of Corona. So the assignment, because I have been doing this for like almost 3 years. So there's a pattern, but right now was completely different. So it was smaller. There is almost no outside pictures. They almost like, I don't remember any of them talking about raining, for instance. There were, I could see a difference between the female perspective, for instance. The food was more present than the male, and the Ramadan. So they were doing fasting, so it appears in many of my papers. So it was very interesting to see how this context also is part of, even if I didn't ask them to do this, it was there. As when I asked them to do the mental maps, you can see some of the mental maps, there is already Corona in the representations. So it was the same case in the water journal.
I also think it's so powerful to read that one response about the cultural uses of water, the difference between Americans just not really thinking about it. And that's like such a powerful moment of pedagogy for other students in the classroom too, who don't realize that actually our uses of water are social. It reminds me briefly, one time I used to work in a restaurant, and when we dumped the coffee, we just let the water run so that it didn't be hot. And I'll never forget the busboy who I worked with was from Uganda. And one time he came over and he shut the water off, and he looked me right in the eye and he said, "You clearly have never walked a mile holding a very heavy pot of water," and then walked away. And I said, "Yep, you're right."
This cultural difference is, it's very common to show up in the water journal. Sometimes they refer to similar to this one, like how is this in my country, or the place where I grew up, or the fact that they have more connection with like water in a natural state, let's say like rivers and this kind of stuff. But also the perspective of being here in a place where people have access and do not pay attention to this. So this is always a topic that you can see and they talk about this in the class. Even who grow up here, when they do the exercise, they start to see, oh my goodness, there's so much water that we use here. And I remember even one student say, I was feeling guilty because I took I was stressed out and I have a bathtub and I was guilty, and I said, this is not my intention. But yeah, like the possibility to have like to have this at home, it's a privilege. It's not like everywhere that you have this. And from that you can connect with many topics. So food production, for instance. So when we have this moment that is more collective, we start to talk about situations and everything, and like how to produce oats, you need water. How to produce the cell phone, you need water. How to produce energy, in some case, you need water. So how water is completely part of the society, and without water, it's impossible to function. I even ask them if they take it out sometimes, because we are made of water. So this is one of the what I do sometimes is to ask them to bring the photos and we put on the wall so they can see each other pictures and they walk around, and from that we start the whole conversation. It's pretty like